When I was in 3rd grade, my mom made me an offer that I couldn't refuse. And the offer was this. She said, if you read just one book that I recommend to you and you don't like it, you will never have to read another book again that I recommend to you. So my mom was very bold. I did read some. I read these books called Goosebumps. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're these horror stories for kids, and like they're all right. They're not really great literature or anything, but I said, okay, Mom, I want you to stop pestering me. She wanted me to read the classics. So the book that she chose was The Count of Monte Cristo, and she gave me an illustrated classics version of that, and that was my first introduction to the classics, and I burned through the book, and I just loved it. I especially loved the part when the main character is trapped in the jail with the old priest, and the old priest is giving him a classical education and teaching him foreign languages, ancient Greek and Latin and all these things. I thought that was so cool. So then I had to reluctantly admit to my mom. She asked me, so what do you think when I finished? And I was like, I guess I liked it. So I very reluctantly agreed that I did like it. And after that, she kept feeding me more books. The Three Musketeers, then pretty soon Hemingway. And I love this stuff. So I continued with my education, and many of you know that I used to be an atheist for a long time. And then my next introduction to the great books was when I happened to accidentally visit Thomas Aquinas College and ended up deciding that instead of going to UC Santa Barbara, where I was accepted to do marine biology, I decided I would go to Thomas Aquinas College instead, and theology would just be some kind of nice enrichment. And I converted my freshman year, which is one of the best things that's ever happened to me, so I'm very thankful for that. In fact, I'd like to dedicate you, if you would have told me that I would teach at a Catholic school back then, it's like, yeah, right. It's like, and you would have told me, oh, you're going to teach Latin, you're going to be giving a talk about, God and the classical education and how all of these things fit together, I would not have believed you. But here I am today, and I'd like to dedicate this talk to my mom for introducing me to the classics, and also to my dad, because he's the one who gave me my first training in the art of dialectic, in reasoning through conversation when I would ask him, but why? But why? But why? And my mom said that she lost patience with me, and my dad would just sit there and give me arguments and arguments and arguments, and then I just switch topics and another why, another why, another why. But we had a lot of conversations about the cosmology and about big picture questions, and he's an atheist as well, but I thank him for introducing me to this way of coming to know. So the question tonight, main question is piety extinct? And I think you may have suspicions about what the answer is going to be. But before we begin the talk, I'd like to give credit where credit's due. So almost all of the ideas in this talk come out of this wonderful book called The Liberal Arts Tradition by Jane and Ravi. And they are two teachers at the Geneva School out in Florida. And the book is absolutely wonderful. It goes into more details about the things that I'm going to speak about tonight. But most everything comes from these guys. So I encourage you to check it out. What is a classical education, and how is it related to piety? Most of us have heard of things like, it's somehow related to grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And we know about those stages in education from the Dorothy Sayers essay. We also may have heard that it's somehow related to the Quadrivium, that these liberal arts, back in the Middle Ages with ancient Greeks, and somehow has to do with forming virtue and all these things. But my goal for you tonight is to gain very precise and great clarity about what precisely a classical education is. So these liberal arts were never intended to be the entirety of an education in the Middle Ages or with the ancient Greeks. And the thesis of the book is that you need a much broader paradigm. You need something that's much more expansive and incorporates the whole human being. So here it is, this wonderful tree. Thank you, Mrs. Favelli, for designing this. It's an illustration that's found in the book, and Mrs. Favelli made it look nice for us. So this education begins in piety, and that's going to be the main theme of the talk tonight. It's foundational. It's at the roots of the tree, more important than anything else. The duty that you show towards your family, towards your country, towards God, these things need to be inculcated, and they need to be taught and imitated at a very young age. So you'll see how this is the foundation for the entirety of an education. Then after that, we move on to training the body with gymnastic, and then tuning the heart with music. And I'll get into precisely what music here means. It's a little bit different than the definition that you may be used to. After that, after we've tuned the heart form the emotions and also train the body. Now we have a body, soul unity in education there. You move on to the intellect. So the liberal arts are how you form habits in your intellect that will produce knowledge. And after you have done all of these stages, then you can move on to the three parts of philosophy, which are metaphysics, moral philosophy, and natural philosophy. And metaphysics is divine philosophy that studies being as such, and moral philosophy studies man, and natural philosophy studies his creation. Once you have a grounding in philosophy, then you can move up to the highest subject, which is theology. So let's take a look a little bit more deeply at our first topic, piety. This painting is, who knows what this painting is? Huh? Mrs. Grimm opened with this painting in morning assembly this year, and since we're doing the whole parent, I was like, yes, we should give the answers. Does anyone know what this is a painting of? So, Mr. Gandhi.
Aeneas fleeing from Troy?
That's right. This is Aeneas fleeing from Troy, and this is the classical image that embodies all three types of piety. So how does it work? How does Aeneas embody duty towards family, duty towards country, and duty towards God? Well, Aeneas is fleeing Troy. This is after the Trojan horse has entered, the Greeks have escaped, they've totally ransacked and destroyed Troy, and the remnants of the Trojans are fleeing, and they've been given a divine commission to go found Rome, to start a new land. And Aeneas is the one that's appointed the task of being the new Trojan leader. So he shows his piety, his duty towards his country, by taking up on himself the role of leading the Trojans. He's also taking upon himself his dad, his father, and he's carrying his father out of the flames. He's got his little son by his side, and his wife is following behind, so he embodies duty towards family in that regard. And in a little bag that his father is clutching, he has the household gods, which the priest of Troy has given to him, and told him, take these gods with you. They're idols, so I hope that you don't take away from this talk that you should worship idols. But it still embodies divine piety and the strong sense of loyalty and duty that the Trojans felt and that the Romans felt in all three of these areas. Here's a quote directly from the book. Piety signifies the duty, love, and respect owed to God, parents, and communal authorities, past and present. It connotes the cultivation of faithfulness in relationships and commitment to one's tradition as historically situated in place and time. So this is a banner. This has been the theme of St. Monica's this year that Mrs. Grimm chose. Our theme for this year is piety. And it helps us to, ultimately what it does is it helps us to know who we are. C.S. Lewis thought that piety was so central in order to receive the tradition from the past, in order to honor your ancestors, those that came before you, to take the best of the past and move forward. If you do not have that as a central part of your culture, then your culture is doomed to failure, and it's going to be swallowed up by other cultures. Impiety can be seen perhaps as the chief vice of our time. Today, men are concerned more with replacing and rebuilding and making a brand new image, rejecting the past in its entirety. And I'm going to make the case that this is a mistake, that we really should take the best of what the past has to offer, and we should pass it on to the next generation. We like revolutions. We talk a lot about revolutions. The Industrial Revolution, Scientific Revolution, the French Revolution, the Sexual Revolution, and we tend to think that it's a good thing. We tend to think that there are good things that have emerged out of many of those revolutions, so I'm not making the statement that there's nothing good that came from them, but I want to raise the question, is it perhaps a sign of our dysfunction that we're so obsessed with overturning everything that came before us? And if you look to traditional cultures like C.S. Lewis does in The Abolition of Man, he looks to Chinese culture, to Indian culture, to many other religions, all of them have in common piety. All of them have a respect for their ancestors, and they have a reverence for what came before them, and they take great care to pass on the collective wisdom of their culture to the next generation. So if we were to look at our own culture and we decided to see, okay, if we want to pass on and transmit the wisdom of our time to the next generation, where would we begin? We could go all the way back to the ancient Greeks and the oracle at Delphi, who above the temple of Apollo was inscribed, "Know thyself," or Socrates, one of the founders of philosophy, said, "An unexamined life is not worth living." So one of the central tenets of Western civilization is this quest to know who you really are. And how do you do that? Well, the answer is piety. If you have a culture that is grounded in piety, if you have an education that's grounded in piety, then you're going to know your situation, you're going to know where you're situated historically. You're going to know what your land is, who you are, what your culture is, what the customs are. If you don't have that, if you're unmoored from those bearings, then you will not be able to know yourself. It's important to know where we came from. So a big part of piety is forming this generation and understanding where did we come from? What's the larger story that we're all a part of, particularly in Western civilization and in the United States? Piety is the faithful devotion manifests in one's actions in word and act. So piety is not a sentiment. This showing your duty towards God, towards your family, towards your country, for the ancients and onward, piety was something that was incarnational. It was embodied. It had to be through concrete actions. Now, earlier, some of you have seen in the flyer that question, why can't I put my elbows on the table? And it has to do with this incarnational nature of piety. Our Lord himself said, love your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love thy neighbor as thyself. And he did not intend for these things to remain mere sentiments. We have concrete ways that we embody these actions, whether it's shaking a hand, saying thank you, calling someone Mr. and Mrs., all of these things, coming together and eating a meal together, looking each other in the eye when you speak. All of these are incarnations of piety. It's how we show our respect, our reverence, and our love for one another. The Ordo Amoris is St. Augustine's term. He thought that a solid education consists in ordering your loves. So one way to frame piety is, okay, you teach children how to say thank you. Why? Because if they imitate, through imitation, you have probably had this experience where a little kid starts saying things and they're just imitating, but they don't understand what they're saying. So they might start saying thank you because they see that you're happy and you clap for them when they say thank you. But if they persist in that habit and they have this habit of piety, then eventually that shapes their love, and that will teach them to respect and revere their peers, respect and revere their elders. So all of this is about ordering loves through concrete action, and that's another way you can understand piety. What do we do in everyday? Here are some examples. Okay, how does piety shape our loves? How does piety teach us who we are? Well, children, are taught at school to raise their hands before they speak. That creates order, but again, similarly to how thank you works, you are acknowledging everyone else in the classroom and that you're not a tyrant who can speak whenever they want to. You have to wait your turn. It's a little mini incarnation of piety. If you do not have these customs in a classroom, then the classroom descends into chaos, and you can see how miserable this poor child is here. Children become miserable when they don't have that structure and order, because we're built to have this. Not C.S. Lewis, but Chesterton says something really funny. He says that humans are made for rules, and a sign of that is that little children will make up rules if they don't have them. So have you ever seen children when they walk on the sidewalk? You can't step on the cracks. Even if you don't give them rules, they invent rules for themselves. That's how much it's a part of our being to be governed by these rules of society and everything else. And all of it, again, is asking the question, how can I live in such a way that I can show my love, respect, and reverence for my neighbor, for my family, for my God, for my country? Another example, when we come together to eat, we don't just sit down and eat from a trough. Human beings have all kinds of ways, all kinds of little customs and traditions that we use to show respect, reverence, and love for one another. So we like to arrange our food in little piles. It makes it feel special. We like to put up candles. Some of us who can afford butlers, no, I'm just kidding. It's like so we can have butlers come, we can have guests come, we dress up nicely. All of these things can be reframed as piety. Why do we dress up nicely? Well, to respect and revere the host and show them that this is a special event. So each one of these things is a little mini incarnation, whereas this guy, maybe sometimes every once in a while you eat like that, but this guy's eating more like an animal. It's like, I've got my drink, I've got a huge pile of food, I have my elbows on the table. So what about the elbows on the table? I've thought about this for a while. So elbows on the table, how many of you have had arguments about that before? There's several of you. Okay, good. So the thing to notice about piety and customs and manners is that a lot of this is conventional. A lot of this doesn't necessarily, sometimes they have origins and reason, and a reasonable thing is what starts the custom. For example, with putting your elbows on the table, I thought maybe in a very crowded circumstances, like in a medieval inn or something, perhaps when you're very crowded, because a meal is ordered towards conversation, and the food is really the occasion for human beings to come together in fellowship, you don't want everyone to be doing this the whole time, because then you can't fit in. But if everyone's sitting like this and taking turns in between conversation eating, then you'll be able to fit more people at the table. Now, I have no idea if that's the actual origin, but here's the takeaway, is it doesn't matter what the origin is. Once it has become a custom, unless it's something very grievous, something morally wrong, once it's a custom, whether or not you like it doesn't matter. The way that you show piety is by adhering to the tradition and the time and the place that you found yourself in. So if I were born into a country where, there are countries where after a meal, it's considered polite to belch very loudly, and if you do not belch very loudly, then the hostess will be very offended. If I did that, if any of you invited me to dinner, I came to your house and I belched very loudly and I said, to heck with your customs, that doesn't really matter to me. I adhere to these customs across the other side of the world, and these are my customs, and this is how. That's an attitude of pride. It's an attitude of pride not to accept your place historically situated in this current culture. And right now, the custom is that when you put your elbows on the table, it's considered rude. Maybe 100 years from now, that will no longer be the custom. But it's important to be attentive to what are the current ways that we express piety, and it's even more important to teach the next generation those customs. So then, we do things at this school, like every morning we say the Pledge of Allegiance. Why? Piety. It's a way that we show our duty, respect, reverence, and love for our country. Some places they take the American flag and burn it or desecrate it in other ways, and that would be an impious action. Okay, that would be the opposite of piety. Even something as simple as kneeling during prayer, we're rational animals, we're soul and body. So what we do with our bodies, all these concrete mini incarnations of piety, actually make a difference and press themselves upon our souls. C.S. Lewis discussed this, what effect it has to kneel, and he definitely said it matters. It matters what position your body is in when you pray. And so if someone says, I like to pray in the lazy boy because I just like to really stretch out. I mean, it's not that you can't pray while you're in the lazy boy. That's not the takeaway. It's just what you do with your body matters, and how you incarnate your reverence. Taking the posture of kneeling shows humility. There's other meanings as well. Now, if even something as small as kneeling or putting your elbows on the table can be an example of piety, how much more important is it when you select your children's curriculum, or when the teachers are thinking, or the curriculum committee is thinking, what should we study here? Either they're going to just think up on their own, I kind of like this topic, I like insects. What do you like? You like photography? Yeah, let's do that. You're excited about photography. You could get the kids excited about photography, right? Or you approach even your education from the perspective of piety. You look back to your ancestors and those who came before you, and you try to understand the larger tradition, the bigger story that you're a part of, and you consult, what did my ancestors consider to be essential and important to pass on to the next generation? So let's take a look at what, before we look at that, Chesterton thought that this was the democracy of the dead, which is a really clever way of saying it. So he said, why is it that someone, just because of the accident of their death, would not be allowed to contribute to society? Just because you're dead, why can't you be someone who influences present-day society? So we look back to the people who came before us to see, what did they consider wise, what did they consider to be the most important? Not that we have to take every last thing that they took as absolute authority, but we want to find what's the best of what they had to offer, so that we can give that as a gift to the current generation. So if we look to the past, if we look to the ancient Greeks, if we look to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, this is the picture that emerges. And sometimes it's counterintuitive, especially the beginning. People are surprised. So after piety comes gymnastic and music. And if you read Plato or the ancient Greeks, you ask them, what should the young people study? They will say gymnastic and music. And at first you're like, wait, shouldn't they be learning to read? Shouldn't they be learning their numbers or something like that? Nope, gymnastic and music. So why do they say that? They say this because human beings are more than just intellects. And so we need to form and train our bodies and we also need to tune our hearts. Both of these subjects are actually broader than we initially think of them. So most people, when they hear gymnastic, they think of the rings and doing the iron cross, or doing a backflip. My students are eagerly awaiting for when I can do a backflip. I actually started a gymnastic course this summer because of this book. So stay tuned. Maybe next time I give a talk, I'll open with a backflip, and then as I trying to live this life. But gymnastic is understood more. We might call it something like athleticism. So even learning to walk would fall under ancient Greek gymnastics. So a child is training their body, learning how to move, and then all the way up through competitive sports, all of those things would fall underneath gymnastics. So it's a training of the body. It's not the iron cross and all those other Olympic events that gymnasts do. And then music as well, I placed an E there because music is something more broad than singing. So music for the ancient Greeks would have been a musical education, would have been an education in imitation and wonder in all the things that the muses inspire. So it's a more broad understanding than just singing. Education is not merely an intellectual affair, not just forming the intellect. You need to form the whole person. And if I had to bring down to one kind of summary of precisely what is a classical education, I would say this. It's actually, the authors would say this, is that it is the development of the inherent capacity of human beings to their full potential. So we have bodies, we're able to walk, we're able to move. You take that body and you see what is the most that it's capable of. What is the most that you as an individual are able to achieve? How far can you throw that javelin? What's the proper technique to throw that javelin? Well, maybe I learned from this guy and I learned something new. Now I can throw it even farther. So we are all able to throw things, and a classical education takes that inherent capacity, tries to develop it to its full potential. We're able to speak. So we take our speech and we perfect it. We make it beautiful. We practice speaking to each other. We're not content to just communicate in grunts. We like to make our language beautiful. Poetry, music, we don't like to just listen to sounds. We like to put patterns into them and create music. So we're able to produce sound, but then we perfect that inherent ability that we've been given. So a summary of classical education can be, take the whole human person, ask what is he capable of, and how can we develop all of those capacities to their full potential. Gymnastic, Plato thought, should be started in the early years but pursued for one's whole life. And Plato said something that's really interesting and rather fun. He said, "It is a great shame if a man grows old not knowing the full beauty of which his body is capable of." And Laocoon, this is a priest, the Trojan priest who is being eaten, his sons are being eaten by serpents. It looks like he took the advice seriously, doesn't it? He's kind of an older guy. He's developed the fullness of his capacities. And I invite all of you to consider this, and as you leave this talk tonight, is what can I do today to become the most beautiful version of myself? Or how can I make my body even more capable? Part of the reason that this whole gymnastic thing started or why I started doing it, because I realized I am so inflexible compared to the little toddlers that are running around. And I've really lost my ability to use my body to its full potential. And so how can I regain that? How can I won't be able to do the things that Kobe can do. There's kind of obvious reasons why, but maybe some height stuff, but it's okay. But I can do a lot more than I currently can do, and my life will be better if I develop those capacities to their full potential. I'll be a happier human being. Not only are there health benefits to gymnastic, this general athleticism, there's also this. This is why it's important and formational for the young. This is the grounds where children learn virtue. It's when you have to move and do something with your body, when you have to persevere and learn how to throw a baseball or how to hit a golf ball properly or whatever else it may be, you're going to acquire certain virtues that will pay off later on in your intellectual life and in your life in general. So that discipline, perseverance, all of those things that you learn through sports, teamwork, this is the kind of training ground for virtue as well. So it's not just a matter of forming your body, it's also a matter of forming the soul through acquiring virtue. A musical education is founded in all of the arts inspired by the Nine Muses. So what are these? You may be familiar with these muses. These are the ones from Hercules, but they're kind of inspired by the previous ones. But these are the Nine Muses, and each one of them has a different symbol, objects that they carry. This one is Clio. She is the muse of history. So notice it's not just music. It's epic poetry, history, music, song, lyric poetry, love poetry, tragedy, hymns, dance, comedy, astronomy. So what unites all of these things for this stage of education? The musical education, what is common to all of these subjects, there's a great diversity of them, is that you do not study them analytically, rather you study them through imitation and simply to delight in them. So this stage of education is designed to enkindle wonder in a student, to form their imagination through good poetry, to form their memory. Introducing, little kids can remember lots and lots of things. Dorothy Sayers would call this the grammatical stage, where you're giving them all the particulars and they're just absorbing, as they participate in these activities, they're absorbing left and right all sorts of things because you're forming their memory and giving them all the concrete particulars that their minds will operate on later. So formation of the imagination, formation of the memory, and the muses are the daughters of the goddess of memory, and I don't think that's accidental. This stage of education, the musical education and the education in gymnastics, Plato and Aristotle didn't disagree on everything, but they didn't agree on everything. They disagreed on some things. Apparently, like what direction to go was the one right here. But there's a Plato's pointing up now. Okay, so he who has received this true education of inner being praises and rejoices in his soul when he receives the good, even before he knows the reason why. And when the reason comes, he will recognize and salute the friend with whom his education has made him long familiar. So it's very interesting. You get this pre-analytical, pre-scientific experience of good things, and before you can even understand why they are good, when you get to philosophy and you start to understand why those things fit with human nature, or you get the reasons why you compose a poem this way, they will seem like old friends to you already, because you've already experienced them so much through imitation. They've been so firmly impressed upon your soul. Aristotle takes it one step further. He goes and says, this musical education is so essential that because it actually develops your ability to intuit the first principles of all of the sciences. So that's actually an incredible statement, that if you do not have a good musical education, if your heart isn't tuned well, if your imagination is not formed well, if your memory is not formed well, you will have a harder time intuiting the first principles of being. It's like a very bold statement. But if you have had a good education in this area, then when you start to recognize these truths, they will seem like old friends to you. Once your reason develops and you reach the age of reason, you'll welcome all of these truths as old friends you've been long familiar with. So let's move to the next stage then. What's the tradition? So after a formation of the body and the heart through imitation, and piety is also in the imitative stage, although all of these continue all the way for the rest of life, then we get to the formation of the intellect, and the formation of the intellect involves the 7 liberal arts. Okay, so the liberal arts, what unites all of them is that they're all tools for producing learning. So they're all tools for producing knowledge, and they're ways to learn, but each one has its own unique mode, and let's take a look at some of those. Now, what does a chimpanzee blacksmith and a man blacksmith and a Euclid prep have in common? Nothing much, other than they're actually useful to teach you 3 medieval distinctions that are helpful for understanding the liberal arts. So here they are. First distinction is imitation. And believe it or not, Google has multiple pictures of monkeys as blacksmith. I thought I was going to have a hard time finding one, and I found one for the presentation for the teachers, and then lo and behold, I found this other guy. Okay, so you can teach a monkey to be a blacksmith, sort of. What you'd be doing there is you would, give him candies or whatever else. You would teach him tricks, and he would learn to take his little hammer and put on his cute little blacksmith hat and take a little horseshoe, and he'd be pretending to be a blacksmith, and maybe you could go to a carnival and everyone would say, oh, what a cute little blacksmith monkey, or maybe a Renaissance fair, that would be even better. And then, but that monkey would not have the art of being a blacksmith. He would simply be imitating what humans do without really understanding the reason why. On the other hand, art, in the medieval sense, is going to be a well-ingrained imitative habit, so that's common with the monkey, that is joined with reason to produce something. So a true blacksmith understands the reasons why he's doing what he's doing. So in the medieval sense, arts unite reason with this habit, with this imitative habit that allows you to produce something like a sword. On the other hand, science, medievals understood science as knowledge. So today we have a much more specific use of the word science. If you ask, what are you studying in science, you'll probably say physics, chemistry, and biology. But the medievals would include under science any form of knowledge. So even theology and philosophy would fall under that category, whereas today you tend to think of them as the humanities. So science is a body of knowledge organized by principles of demonstrative reason, and it requires a knowledge of the causes, but it doesn't produce anything of its own. So blacksmithing produces swords. Science is simply the knowledge that you possess, the knowledge that is good for its own sake. Now, in a medieval worldview, you could give a reason why, for so many of these things that we have a hard time explaining today, the medieval worldview would be able to tell you exactly why. Why is it that little kids are curious to know things? Why is it that adults want to learn? Why is it that wherever you look, humans seem to thrive the more that they know? Well, the medievals would have said, because man, and the ancient Greeks too, that man is a rational animal. Man is not just an animal. He's not content to simply have his animal desires satisfied. He needs to also fulfill his reason. He needs to come to know, and he increases his being. He perfects his being by coming to knowledge. So knowledge is good for its own sake in the medieval worldview, and particularly the knowledge of the sciences. You don't need to use this knowledge for anything else, whereas today we tend to have a more utilitarian approach towards knowledge. What is this going to be good for? I surprised my calculus students one day when they said, "Why is it that I have to learn this? I'm never going to use it for anything." And I told the students, "I think you're probably right. You probably won't ever really use it for anything." And he said, "Wait, you're not supposed to say that. You're our math teacher. You're supposed to say that this is useful." And I said to him, it is very useful. Lots of people use calculus for lots of things, but that's not why you should study it. You should study it because it perfects your being to know, and because it's beautiful. Calculus is wonderful, and you will be a happier person and you will thrive more if you receive this, gem of human achievement, which is the calculus. We'll see how well it works out. But he was very shocked by the answer. Okay, so what are the liberal arts then? The liberal arts, all 7 of these, produce works of reason. They are the tools of learning through which arguments, poems, and proofs are uncovered. They offer the tools through which science is demonstrated and reality is encountered. So you're equipping the intellect with all of the tools that it needs to uncover truth in so many areas. The first division in the liberal arts is going to be between the Trivium and the Quadrivium. So the Trivium are the linguistic tools that humans are capable of using to produce knowledge, and the Quadrivium are the mathematical arts, the mathematical tools that we have to come to knowledge. The Trivium means the 3 ways, consists of grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. In their most basic sense, grammar has to do with understanding language, dialectic with dialogic reasoning, and rhetoric with the artful composition of text, written and spoken. So let's look at each one of those in a little bit more particular detail. So what does it look like to come to understanding language? Understanding language is one of those things that is uniquely human and very baffling, very difficult to explain. In fact, it was a central piece in my own conversion. How is it possible that human beings are able to understand things like triangles? How is it possible that I can give you a definition of what it means to be a triangle, a definition of what it means to be a man, and that definition applies to all human beings, even the ones that don't even exist yet, or all the I don't have to see thousands of triangles to come to know what it means to be a triangle. How is it that I'm able to abstract this universal concept from reality and come to know something that applies to all triangles that have ever existed, that ever will exist? Are all humans that ever have existed and ever will exist? Animals don't do this. And even more mysterious, how is it that I'm able to articulate this with speech? How is it that I can tell Mr. Quackenbush here the word cat, and he immediately understands what I mean? He knows exactly what I'm referring to. He probably thought of some cute little cat in his mind. No, I'm just kidding. So anyway, humans it's very bizarre that we're able to use speech in this way, and it's a central tool of learning is to understand language. Nietzsche thought it was so powerful, this order that is inside of human beings. He said the reason we can't get rid of God is because we haven't yet been able to rid ourselves of grammar. Now, going back to this painting of Aeneas, so what did a grammatical education consist of in the past? In the past, this education would primarily be reading primary text, the best literature that had been given up to that point. And think of why if you try to grasp literature, something like the Aeneid, Why is it that that would fulfill all of the common things we think of when we think of the grammatical stage? To understand this event in the Trojan War, you're going to need to know some geography, you're going to need to know history, you're going to need to know mythology, and here's the real kicker. How did this education happen in the past? By reading the primary texts in the original languages, by reading them and speaking about them in the original languages. So imagine that. Now not only do you have to know the geography, history, mythology, all the meanings of the words, all the definitions of the foreign language, the words in the foreign language, you also need to understand the grammar that underlies that language and all of the principles of language that go into it. This W.H.D. Rouse is the editor of the Loeb Classics, and those are primary texts written in ancient Greek and Latin, and they have an English to Latin facing pages. One side is the Latin, the other side is the English. He gives a strong case for why we should do our best to return to this tradition, and he lists many, many benefits, but he says basically it comes back to piety again. If you want to understand where you came from, most everything through the 1600s was written in Latin. The best of what the Roman world offered us is what we built our society on, and then the Romans received that from the Greeks. So in order to understand who you are and where your place is in Western culture, you need to return, they call it returning to ad fontes, back to the fonts, back to the sources, the well springs of wisdom. The Renaissance was born out of this. The Renaissance was born out of the rediscovery of the Greek and Greek classics, and then a rebirth of culture. This great flourishing happened because of that rediscovery. Now, I think we may be on the edge of a new Renaissance. It's kind of interesting, and the United States is the one that's leading it. If you talk to Europeans, where should you go to study a classical education? Mr. Haggard is a new teacher here. He taught in France for a couple of years, and he said the French told him, oh, they said classical education, that's silly. You should go to the United States if you like that. You know, so there's the West is rapidly abandoning its tradition, and the place where it's being reborn in a kind of new renaissance of classical education is here in the United States. And perhaps, maybe as the medievals rediscovered the ancient Greeks, perhaps we are rediscovering the medievals, and that medieval mindset, which is what most of this talk is based on, is what is leading, or the intellectual framework within which this new rebirth of culture is happening. Dialectic is the art of reasoning. So oftentimes it's referred to as logic, and the reason that we call it dialectic is, one, that's what the medievals called it, but two, formal logic is only part of the picture. So the art of coming to knowledge through conversation, through dialogue with others, this is the art of dialectic. Socrates is one of the pinnacles of this art if you read the Socratic dialogues, but even higher than Socrates was St. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote the Summa and a vast number of other works. And what he would do, if you're familiar with that format, is he would basically he would ask a question, then he would give the strongest possible objections to that question. So whether or not God exists, and then he'd give all the strongest objections that he could think of for why you might think God does not exist. Then he would consult his grammatical education and sift through all of the vast knowledge, all of the things he had read up to that point, all of the best that the past had to offer, and give a counter opinion. God does exist because in the scriptures it states that God is real, for example. And then he would give his own arguments for God's existence. In fact, he gave 5 proofs for God's existence. And then he would go back and answer each one of those objections and explain precisely where they went wrong. What is the truth they were not seeing that allowed them to fall into that objection? So this kind of reasoning with yourself and giving the strongest possible arguments for one side, the strongest possible arguments for the other side, in order to arrive at the truth, would be an example of the art of reasoning found in dialectic. Rhetoric consists in the artful communication of the truth. So for a while there was this debate about whether or not rhetoric should be included as part of an education. And the reason was rhetoric is the art of persuasion. You can persuade people to good or bad things. So there were a lot of Platonists who thought rhetoric was more like candy making, more like turning things sweet without any real substance. So rhetoric should not be studied. But then it was eventually, this battle was kind of won by St. Augustine. St. Augustine said, you know, if falsehood can use rhetoric, then who is to say that truth should not also use rhetoric to defend the truth? So as long as you have it ordered towards the truth, rhetoric is one of the liberal arts that's included in a classical education. Cicero said, movere, docere, delectare. So to move, to teach, and to speak, these are the functions of rhetoric. And then ethos, pathos, and logos are the three means of persuasion. Are you going to appeal to someone's conscience, to their feelings, or to their reason when you're giving a speech or something like that? So rhetoric can be viewed, according to Aristotle, as of all the different means of persuasion I have available to me. Like for this talk tonight, there's lots of different things that I could have chosen to prepare. A good rhetorician would choose the most persuasive things available to him out of all the means available to persuade an audience of a certain point they were trying to make. The other liberal arts are in the quadrivium, and these are the four ways. These are the mathematical arts. Today we tend to view mathematics as primarily useful, and the only reason you should use it, or the only reason you should study it, is if you're going to use it. This is where that question comes from. Why should I study this if I'm never going to use it? Okay, but for the medievals and the ancient Greeks, all the way back to Pythagoras, math was a very different kind of study. In fact, all the way through, I think, through the 17th century, mathematics was not very much considered to be very useful. I mean, you could do accounting and things like that, but no one predicted the extraordinary ways in which mathematics would apply to the universe itself and to nature itself, because back then they had a view, especially the ancient Greeks, that the material world was inferior. It was not possible for the material world to behave mathematically. There's no way. They would have been astonished with all the discoveries we've made in physics about precisely how mathematically the natural world behaves. They thought that matter was inferior and that mathematics only applied to the heavenly realm, to the stars up above. So what was their view of mathematics? Plato believed that the study of mathematics leads the mind toward pure reason and cultivates the true love of wisdom, the origin of the term philosophy. By training one's thoughts on the perfections of mathematics, the mind learns to transcend the level of changing opinions to identify objective truth. So studying mathematics was done in order to arrive at wisdom. It's the place where you can perceive the truth with the greatest clarity. It's very easy to tell when someone's wrong in math because the answers are very clear. In some way, math is the easiest subject because it's the easiest one to know precisely how to reason and precisely where someone went wrong in their reasoning. So it's the place where you can get closest to the truth, and the truth, as the ancients believe, is transformative. The four parts of the quadrivium are arithmetic, which studies discrete quantity at rest. So discrete quantities like human beings or chairs, things that are not united as one being but have their own unity. I can count the number of chairs in this room. Then what I can do is I can abstract and come to a notion of what it means to be number, and I can study the relationships between these numbers. And I could form something like Pascal's triangle, and you may already see some patterns. You may even be able to discover what is the rule that I've used to create Pascal's triangle. And then once you study the Pascal's triangle even more, you start to notice some other relationships. Now, mathematics was viewed as a mystical kind of subject that brought you closer to God. And the central mystery of arithmetic is the one and the many. How can something be simultaneously multiple things? Like I have 2 arms, 2 eyes. I can, I don't want to, but I can be chopped up into several different ways. In several different ways I can be chopped up and become more than one. I don't want to become more than one. But what is that unity that holds me together as one thing as opposed to many things? Now, this goes all the way out to the universe itself. One of the great mysteries of modern physics is there really one unified theory that can describe everything? Is there at the heart of the universe one principle that you can explain all of physics with? Is there a unity that holds? Clearly there is some unity that holds together the cosmos. The universe is universus, the one turning, the one thing having been turned. So what is it that holds that together? How is the universe one? And then in case you think this only applies to nature, what about God? How is it? It's the central mystery of our faith. How can God be one and many at the same time? How can it be 1 and 3? That's built in as a central mystery. Mathematics is built in as a central mystery of our faith. Then with geometry is probably the greatest place to learn the art of reasoning logically through syllogisms. And the geometry teachers can attest to this. The students also go to the board and demonstrate Euclid propositions, which give arguments for geometrical truths in a syllogistic fashion. Geometry was so powerful a tool that it was an essential part of the curriculum to study Euclid's elements all the way through the Middle Ages and later. In fact, Abraham Lincoln found a copy of Euclid's elements, and he used to do Euclid propositions on the back of a shovel with a stone because it really struck him that if I'm going to be a good lawyer, this is what I need to know. I need to know this inside and out, because here is how you make arguments. This man Euclid, he understands what it means to give an argument. So that's one of the benefits of studying geometry. But it also raises a lot of interesting questions about continuity. Precisely what does it mean to be a continuous quantity? Or precisely how can a straight line be one thing, yet I can divide it into an infinite amount of straight lines? How can I chop it any way that I please, and it seems to be indefinitely visible into multiple parts? And is a line composed of an infinite amount of points, or is there something else going on? So one of these central mysteries, again, in mathematics is the mystery of the finite and the infinite. And how can those two things be reconciled? Then astronomy is an extremely powerful liberal art. The history of astronomy is extraordinary. So starting with Ptolemy, there was this kind of debate about what is the true nature of the world. So the heavenly realm is up there. We can't really get to it. We don't know how. We see that it moves in perfect circles. So very early on, with the Egyptians and probably even earlier than the Egyptians, man has been fascinated with the stars and the heavens. And is there a mathematical law that I can come up with to predict how these heavenly spheres will move? Ptolemy and others with him said the best we can do when it comes to describing the heavens is to create mathematical models that predict how the heavens move, but we do not know if that's in fact how they move. We don't know the truth of the matter. We see our observations, but we can never get out there, we can never see them, so we can't actually arrive at truth through astronomy. The best we can do is to arrive at mathematical models that describe how things work. Now, music, on the other hand, so the liberal art of music is more broad, again, than we typically give credit for. So there are three divisions of music. One was the music of instruments, which would be what you normally consider music: singing, reading sheet music, understanding that an octave is produced by a string that's twice as long as another one set to the same tension. So this 1 to 2 mathematical relationships built into music. I like to tell my students this. They tell me, "Oh, Mr. Selmeczy, I'm not a math person." And I look them straight in the eye and I tell them, you are a math person, because to be human is to be a math person. And I give them this argument. I say this. I say, if I were to play, some fun Taylor Swift song or whatever else you guys like to listen to, a lot of you would start tapping your feet. If I play random noises to you, none of you will start tapping your feet. Why is it that human beings are this strange animal that really enjoys regular sound intervals that are broken into units of 4, 8, and then 16. Utterly bizarre. No other animal likes that. Why is it that we like that kind of rhythmic pattern built into our music? Why is it that we enjoy the harmonies that are produced by mathematical ratios among the strings? Why is it that we get teary-eyed when the string instruments come in, when Gandalf's dying in Lord of the Rings? It was like, why is it that humans can be moved to tears by the power of music? And the musical relationships, the relationships between the notes and the string lengths, are precise mathematical relationships. It's as if human beings are a mathematical animal whose soul has been created to be moved by mathematical relationships found in sound. Utterly strange. Totally bizarre for old atheist Mr. Selmeczy. You tell him that, it's like, okay, Mr. Selmeczy, how would you explain this one? It's just a very interesting, very wonderful thing that human beings are so moved by mathematics. The other part of music was the music of man, the study of the harmonies and proportions that are within human beings and in the relationships between human beings. And the third, which is the most interesting for our purposes, is the study of the music of the world. So ever since the time of the ancient Greeks, there was this intuition that the world was mathematical, that if you look out at the heavenly spheres, you would be able to describe, Plato thought they were moved by music, that the fundamental moving principle of the universe was music. And sounds kind of like, okay, that's kooky, it's a little bit strange, Plato. But if you understand music as harmony or mathematical proportion, then tell me what else is A equals F over m. So acceleration is going to be the force divided by the mass. The larger the force, there's a direct one-to-one relationship there. The larger the acceleration, that's a linear proportion. There's an inverse proportion with mass. The smaller the mass, and it's a mathematically precise proportion. Or how is it that E equals mc squared? Or that the distance traveled by an object is going to be 1, help me out here, 1/2 AT squared. So why are these mathematical relationships built into nature itself? That is what the liberal art of music studies. So that part of music that studies the harmonies within the world. And it turns out that Plato was actually very right, that there are physical laws that are mathematical built into nature itself. Now, they're not exactly how he thought they were, but the general point is true, that we have this bizarre universe that obeys the laws of mathematics. So the history of astronomy, there was a surprise twist where all these liberal arts started to intertwine. Okay, so with Descartes on the left here, he started to integrate arithmetic and geometry and integrate that with algebra and produce the Cartesian coordinate system, which students love so much. They love graphing parabolas and all those ellipses and all those equations and everything else. They have Descartes to thank for that. And then Newton, the central man here, he started to integrate in calculus, which he kind of invented to support his universal theory of gravitation. He started to integrate geometry and arithmetic even more, understanding the areas under curves and using the finite and the infinite and infinitesimals. And so there's this great synthesis of mathematics that was welling up. On the other hand, in astronomy, so remember, mathematics is pure mathematics, not really supposed to apply to the world. There's Copernicus, who is Ptolemy. Remember, he says, you can't really know how things actually move. The best you can do is you can come up with mathematical models that save the appearances and just predict how they move, but you don't really know if that's actually how they move. Well, Copernicus is the first one to say, I do think that the sun is at the center of the solar system. I don't think that's a mathematical model. I think that it's actually the case. And then Kepler, with his elliptical orbits, said even more strongly that harmonies are what move the solar system, and that these ellipses are real. The planets actually move on ellipses. So you're starting to take mathematics and apply it to nature itself. And then Newton is the one who shatters the realm of the heavenly spheres. Remember, with the ancient Greeks, there was a different physics that operated on the ground than in the heavens. In the heavens, everything moved eternally in perfect circles. On the ground, objects, because of various forces like friction, eventually come to their natural resting place. And there was a fundamental belief that nature in the heavens operated according to different laws than on earth. And Newton starts a revolution when he proves, with his universal theory of gravitation, justified by calculus, that the same physics that works on Earth, the famous apple dropping story, can explain why that large rock up there, the moon, stays up there too. And it can explain why the eclipses of the moon happen, why the eclipses of the moon happen, why the eclipses of Jupiter happen at the time that they do. So Newton shatters the heavenly spheres and unites the entirety of the universe and makes this bold claim that gravity is not just true on Earth, it's true everywhere in the solar system, and he even says everywhere in the universe. One realm. So music and astronomy fused together, this mathematical system to describe the world, ends up being the great harmony, the great inverse square relationship that describes all of reality. Finally, this education, if we consult the past, what's the tradition that we're all a part of, culminates in philosophy, which the medievals would have understood as having 3 parts that study God, his image, man, and his creation. So metaphysics, moral philosophy, and natural philosophy. And the key insight is that philosophy is about not just about acquiring knowledge, but really loving the truth. So for example, the goal is not to just get more and more knowledge. The goal is to rest in and to contemplate and to love the truths that you already know. It's a much more, if you'd like to say, personal thing. And then finally, at the top of the tree, all of this is reaching upwards towards theology, which is the queen of the sciences. And there was a very specific definition back then. So theology was considered a science. Why? Because just as geometry is considered a science, the knowledge you come to in geometry is a science because it is produced by demonstrative reason. It operates on first principles, on postulates, on premises, builds up arguments, and then gets to new truths. While sacred scripture, the science of theology does the same. The science of theology doesn't begin with postulates and common notions and definitions of triangles, but rather the sacred scriptures themselves as its first principles. So the first principles that theology operates on and builds arguments from are what's revealed in the sacred scriptures. And that's the top of the tree and the queen of the sciences. So there's the whole model. There's the whole model, the great tradition of a classical education. And this is the book, in case you'd like to pick it up. The liberal arts tradition A Philosophy of Christian Classical Education dives into more detail about all of these topics that we've discussed tonight. But notice that the thesis is, okay, grounded in piety, which also has to do, part of it has to do with God. And then up at the top, we also have God, and governed by theology. Some people would get angry about that language. How dare you send your child to a school where they're brainwashed and it's governed by theology? All the other subjects are tyrannically oppressed by this evil thing, theology, and all those bishops and cardinals and everyone is there standing and judging them and always just beating down the scientists and never allowing them to thrive. Okay, so in what way does theology govern all of the rest of the subjects? I'd like to demonstrate to you with one example that, seen properly, first this education begins in imitation, then it discovers all the way up the tree what can be known through natural reason, all the way through metaphysics, and then reason and all prior subjects are illuminated as a light from within by divine revelation. So divine revelation isn't an oppressive tyrant. It is rather something that from within illuminates and gives even greater clarity to those who study these lower subjects. The truths discovered by natural reason along the way, the truths discovered by the ancient Greeks and the Romans, those are actually enriched and confirmed by reason. So there's a very strange thing happens, which is that the scriptures come in and tend to affirm a lot of the truths that are discovered by natural reason. That only makes sense if there's one author of all of these subjects. It would be very strange if all these different cultures writing the scriptures at different times ended up affirming the same truths. And my favorite example of this that I'd like to share with you is the example of light as an image of God. So in the scriptures, oftentimes God refers to himself as light. Okay, so St. Augustine says that in order to understand a sign, in order to understand a symbol, we need to understand what the thing is. And that's problematic with light, because we don't really understand what light is, and especially the ancient Greeks didn't understand precisely what light was. So why is God calling himself the light when we don't really know what it is? Well, there's lots of ways that light, even for the ancients, would have worked as a good symbol. For example, light dispels darkness. It's only when the light comes on that we're able to understand and perceive the things around us. Our primary sense organ that we use to gain information are our eyes. So light works for the ancient Greeks as well as an analogy for what God does for the soul. It can open it up, allow it to be more receptive to reality, just as your eyes, when they're opened up, receive truth and reality from the outside world. But here's what's beautiful, and this is an example of how theology can enrich science, modern science, physics, and how physics can enrich modern theology. So what have we discovered about light since then? Since the times of the ancients, and with all the Einstein's relativity and all the things that we've learned about light since then, we've learned some incredible things. Okay, so first, we know from physics, and I ran this by our physics teacher, Mr. Fryman, and he okayed me, Mr. Quackenbush and I, we all had a great conversation about this. How much force would you need to accelerate this remote to the speed of light? The equations predict you would need an infinite force. You would need an infinite force to accelerate not just this remote, but even a single atom to the speed of light. Okay, infinite force to get to the speed of light. Okay, what else do we know about light? Light is not just visible light. Light includes a broad spectrum of radio waves and X-rays and all kinds of other electromagnetic radiation that we've discovered since then, but all of them are light. All of them are electromagnetic waves. Some of these, like radio waves, can pass through very large objects, and they're very powerful. So you ask yourself this question: where does light exist in the universe? Light exists everywhere in the universe, all the way to the edges, expanding at the speed of light. It exists everywhere, requires an infinite force to be able to go at its speed. Gets even more bizarre. If you could somehow get inside of light, imagine you get into a photon. So the equations predict that as you approach the speed of light, time in your frame of reference slows down relative to other frames of reference. You have probably seen sci-fi movies that use this premise. What if you were inside of the light? If you were inside of the light, the equations predict that no time would pass. No time would pass for you. You would be a timeless being if you were inside of light. Infinite force, present everywhere, timeless. And now check this out. If you're in the center here, let's say that's the center of the universe, and you're light, and you're moving over to the edges, and you're another piece of light, you move that way, you're another photon, you travel that way. If you are all traveling to the edges of the universe in a moment, what happens to that center point and the outer point that you're traveling to? All times and all places shrink down to one singularity. If you go from here to here in a moment, those 2 points are not different for you. They are one. And not just those 2 points, but the entire universe, all time, all places, would shrink down to one single point, a singularity, so that you would see all events and all times as one single moment. Infinite force, timeless, everywhere, sees everything all at once in one moment. Last thing, the greatest mystery in the physical universe is light. We don't understand something about it. We don't understand how can it be both a wave and a particle at once. How can it have these 2 different natures? How can it have 2 natures and be one being? Sounds like something else that I know of. Okay, and this is the big kicker, is that God, yes, God is omnipotent. Only God could accelerate an object to the speed of light. God is everywhere. He's omnipresent. God is omniscient. He knows all things. God is timeless. God is Jesus Christ, true God and true man, one being. And God didn't look out at the universe that was already made and say, let's see, should I compare myself to that Starbucks cup, the sunglasses, the light on that table, or the animal over there? You know, it's like, he didn't look out at a table full of things and say, which one should I compare myself to? He made everything on the table to be the way that it is so that we could learn about him, so that we could come to know about him. He knew all of the things that we would discover about him in the future. He knew all the things we would learn about light, and he knew when he wrote the scriptures that we would discover those things. So he anticipated and he made light to be that way that it is, in order that we might discover these things about light and learn more clearly what a wonderful image light truly is for him. So a physicist who does not study theology, who does not have this integrated education, even though light is miraculous and wonderful, it's an incredible thing to study, is not as rich as a physicist who has studied theology. But the flip side is also true. So a theologian who doesn't know this physics is also deprived because he doesn't understand just what an incredible image for God light is. So in this kind of an education, a classical education, you start to see multiple paths that converge again and again. And the farther you go into one subject, there's a beautiful, there's a story by Flannery O'Connor called Everything That Rises Must Converge. And so as you study all the parts of this tree, as you start in one area and you start moving upward, as you acquire wisdom, as you acquire virtue, as you elevate your soul, all of these things, you're following a divine thread of causality. And as you dive deeper, as you go higher, it's all being woven back to the same source. And that's because the reason theology does not govern as a tyrant, but rather as a light that illuminates from within, is because all of the subjects below that are discovered by natural reason and theology have one and the same author, and that's Jesus Christ himself. Thank you.